The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as 16-year-old Zoe Martinez walked home from the public library, her backpack heavy with borrowed books and completed homework assignments. She had always been a diligent student, spending hours after school in the quiet sanctuary of the library where she could focus without the distractions of home. Today had been particularly productive, and she felt satisfied as she made her way through the familiar neighborhood streets. Zoe was a petite girl with long, dark hair that she kept neatly braided, and despite her youth, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from being raised in a household that valued respect, education, and personal integrity. Her father had always taught her to be polite to authority figures, to keep her head up, and to never be ashamed of who she was or where she came from. These lessons had served her well throughout her life, though she had never imagined they would be put to such a test. As she turned the corner onto Pine Avenue, Zoe noticed a police cruiser parked along the sidewalk. The sight didn't alarm her initially, as patrol cars were a common sight in their neighborhood. However, as she approached, she became aware that the officer standing beside the vehicle was watching her intently. Officer Brandon Cross was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s with close-cropped hair and sharp features that seemed permanently fixed in a scowl. He had been with the police force for 8 years, though his career had been marked by numerous complaints and disciplinary actions that somehow never seemed to stick. Cross stepped into Zoe's path as she attempted to walk by, his hand resting casually on his belt near his radio. His partner, Detective Maria Santos, remained in the passenger seat of the cruiser, though Zoe could see her watching the interaction with what appeared to be growing discomfort. Santos was a veteran officer with 15 years on the force, and she had learned to recognize when Cross was about to overstep his bounds, though she had never found the courage to intervene directly. "Hold up there, miss," Cross said, his voice carrying an authoritative tone that immediately made Zoe feel uneasy. "Where are you coming from in such a hurry?" Zoe stopped walking and turned to face the officer, remembering her father's teachings about being respectful and cooperative with law enforcement. "Good afternoon, officer. I'm just walking home from the library," she replied politely, adjusting the straps of her backpack nervously. Cross looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism, taking in her modest clothing, her school backpack, and her generally neat appearance. For reasons that even he couldn't fully articulate, something about her calm demeanor irritated him. Perhaps it was the way she looked him directly in the eye without showing the deference he felt he deserved. Or maybe it was simply that he was having a bad day and needed someone to take it out on. "The library, huh?" he said, stepping closer. "What were you really doing there? Meeting someone? Planning something?" His tone had shifted from professional inquiry to accusatory interrogation, and several passers-by had begun to slow their pace to observe the interaction. Zoe felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composure. "I was studying and doing homework, sir. I can show you my library card if you'd like," she offered, reaching slowly toward her backpack. "Don't move," Cross barked, causing Zoe to freeze mid-motion. "Keep your hands where I can see them. You could be reaching for anything in there." By now, a small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the officer's raised voice and aggressive posture. Detective Santos shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat, finally rolling down her window. "Brandon, everything okay out?" "There," she called, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Cross ignored his partner's question and continued his focus on Zoe. "Empty that backpack. Right here, right now. Let's see what you're really carrying around." His demand was delivered with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, though legally he had no grounds for such a search. Zoe's hands trembled slightly as she slowly lowered her backpack to the ground and began removing its contents. One by one, she pulled out textbooks, notebooks filled with her careful handwriting, pens and pencils, and a small lunch container. The mundane nature of the items only seemed to fuel Cross's irritation rather than satisfy his suspicions. "What's this?" he demanded, picking up one of her notebooks and flipping through it roughly. The pages contained detailed notes from her history class, complete with carefully drawn diagrams and highlighted passages. "Looks like you're planning something. What are all these notes about?" "It's my history homework, sir," Zoe replied, her voice beginning to waver slightly. "We're studying the civil rights movement." The irony of the situation was not lost on her, though she was too frightened to appreciate it fully. Cross snorted derisively. "Civil rights, huh? I bet that's exactly what this is about. You kids today, always thinking you know better than the people trying to protect you." He tossed the notebook back onto the pile of her belongings scattered on the sidewalk, some pages fluttering in the afternoon breeze. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people had begun pulling out their phones. Mrs. Helen Torres, a middle-aged woman who lived in the neighborhood, had positioned herself where she could clearly see the interaction and was discreetly recording the encounter. She had witnessed Cross's behavior before and had always regretted not speaking up or documenting the incidents. "Officer, is this really necessary?" called out Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who had known Zoe since she was a small child. "She's just a kid walking home from school." Cross whirled around to face the growing crowd, his face flushed with anger and authority. "Everyone step back. This is police business, and I don't need civilians telling me how to do my job." His voice carried across the street, drawing even more attention to the scene. Turning back to Zoe, who was now kneeling on the sidewalk trying to gather her scattered belongings, Cross's demeanor became even more aggressive. "Stand up," he ordered. "Put your hands behind your back. You're being detained for suspicious behavior and resisting a lawful order." "But I haven't resisted anything," Zoe said, her voice finally breaking with emotion. "I've done everything you asked. Please, can I just call my father?" The mention of calling her father seemed to trigger something in Cross, perhaps reminding him of other encounters where parents had complained about his conduct. "Your father?" He laughed harshly. "What's Daddy going to do? Come down here and argue with me? I've dealt with plenty of parents who think their precious little angels can do no wrong." Detective Santos had finally exited the patrol car and was approaching the scene, her face showing clear concern about how the situation was escalating. "Brandon, maybe we should calm this down a bit," she suggested quietly, though her words carried little conviction. "Don't tell me how to handle this, Santos," Cross snapped back. "This girl was acting suspicious, and now she's being uncooperative. That's grounds for detention in my book." Zoe looked up at the officer towering over her, tears beginning to form in her eyes despite her efforts to remain strong. "Please, sir, I just want to go home. I haven't done anything wrong. Can I please just call my father?" Cross leaned down closer to her, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that only she could hear clearly. "You can call whoever you want from the station, Princess. But right now, you're going to learn what happens to kids who don't show proper respect to law enforcement." The crowd had grown restless, with several people now openly recording the interaction, and others making phone calls of their own. Mrs. Torres had captured the entire encounter on her phone, her hands shaking with anger as she watched the young Girl being systematically humiliated for no apparent reason. "This is wrong," someone called out from the crowd. "She's just a child." Cross straightened up and addressed the gathered crowd with false authority. "This individual was behaving suspiciously and has been uncooperative with a lawful investigation. I have every right to detain her until we can verify her identity and intentions." As if the universe itself was responding to the injustice unfolding, on the sidewalk, Zoe's phone began to ring from inside her backpack. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere, and Cross immediately reached for it. "Don't answer that," he commanded, though Zoe had made no move toward the device. "Nobody makes any calls until I say so." But Zoe had managed to glance at the caller ID before Cross could stop her, and her heart lifted slightly when she saw Dad displayed on the screen. Somehow, her father always seemed to call at exactly the right moment, as if he possessed some parental intuition that told him when she needed him most. "That's my father calling," she said, looking up at Cross with the first hint of hope she had felt since the encounter began. "He's probably wondering why I'm late getting home. Please, can I just answer it and let him know I'm okay?" Cross's expression darkened further at her words. "Your father can wait," Cross said coldly. "Right now you're going to learn that actions have consequences, and disrespecting a police officer is not something that Daddy can fix with a phone call." The phone continued to ring, its insistent tone creating an additional layer of tension in an already volatile situation. Detective Santos looked increasingly uncomfortable as she watched her partner's behavior escalate, knowing that the situation was spiraling far beyond what the circumstances warranted. As the phone finally stopped ringing, Zoe felt a moment of despair wash over her. She had always been taught that police officers were there to help and protect people, but this experience was shattering those beliefs in real time. She couldn't understand what she had done to deserve this treatment, and the public nature of the humiliation made it even worse. "Now then," Cross continued, his voice carrying a tone of satisfied authority, "let's discuss what's going to happen next. You're going to come with me to the station, where we can have a proper conversation about respect and following lawful orders." But as he spoke those words, another phone began ringing, this time from inside the patrol car, where Detective Santos had left her own device. The ringtone was different, more official, and Santos immediately recognized it as her direct line from the precinct. The convergence of these two phone calls, combined with the growing crowd and the increasingly tense atmosphere, created a sense that something significant was about to change. Cross remained focused on Zoe, unaware that the forces he had set in motion were about to reshape the entire encounter in ways he could never have anticipated. The stage was set for a revelation that would transform this routine harassment into something far more consequential, though at that moment only Zoe had any sense of the authority that was about to be brought to bear on the situation. The tension on Pine Avenue reached a breaking point as Officer Cross prepared to escort Zoe to his patrol car. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 30 people, with many holding up their phones to record what was clearly becoming an abuse of police power. The afternoon sun seemed to spotlight the scene, casting harsh shadows that made Cross's aggressive posture appear even more menacing. Detective Santos answered her ringing phone with obvious reluctance, knowing that any call to her direct line during patrol hours usually meant complications. "Santos here," she said, stepping away from the main confrontation while keeping her eyes on Cross and Zoe. "Detective, this is dispatch. We've received multiple calls about an incident on Pine Avenue involving Officer Cross. Can you confirm the situation?" The dispatcher's voice carried a note of concern that immediately put Santos on high alert. Affirmative, dispatch. We have a situation developing here, Santos replied, choosing her words carefully while watching Cross roughly guide Zoe toward the patrol car. The girl was cooperating completely, but Cross seemed determined to treat her as if she were a dangerous criminal. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Judge Roberto Martinez was driving through the same neighborhood when his phone rang again. He had tried calling Zoe twice already, and her failure to answer was highly unusual. As one of the most respected federal judges in the state, Judge Martinez maintained a careful balance between his professional responsibilities and his role as a single father. Since his wife's death 5 years earlier, Zoe had become the center of his world, and his protective instincts were finely tuned to any signs that she might be in trouble. This time, he decided to try a different approach and called the school to see if Zoe had stayed late for any activities. When the secretary informed him that Zoe had left at her usual time to go to the library, his concern deepened. She was nothing if not punctual, and her routine was as reliable as clockwork. Judge Martinez made a quick decision and changed his route, driving toward the library to retrace Zoe's likely path home. As he turned onto Pine Avenue, he immediately noticed the unusual crowd gathered on the sidewalk and the flashing lights of a police cruiser. His judicial experience had taught him to read situations quickly, and something about the scene ahead triggered every alarm bell in his mind. Back at the confrontation, Cross had become increasingly agitated by the growing crowd and their obvious disapproval of his actions. Several people were now openly calling out objections to his treatment of Zoe, and he could hear snippets of conversations where bystanders were discussing whether to call the police about the police. "All of you need to disperse immediately," Cross shouted at the crowd, his voice cracking slightly with stress. "This is an active police investigation, and you're interfering with official business." Mrs. Helen Torres, who had been recording the entire encounter, stepped forward slightly. "Officer, this young lady has been nothing but polite and cooperative. Why are you treating her like a criminal?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had raised 6 children and was not easily intimidated. Cross whirled to face her, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon, in a gesture that sent a ripple of alarm through the crowd. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and stop interfering with this arrest." "What exactly is she being arrested for?" called out Mr. Peterson, the elderly man who had spoken up earlier. "Walking home from the library? Carrying school books?" The questions from the crowd seemed to fuel Cross's anger rather than prompt any self-reflection. In his mind, these civilians simply didn't understand the complexities of police work or the split-second decisions that officers had to make to maintain public safety. The fact that a 16-year-old girl posed no apparent threat to anyone seemed irrelevant to his increasingly paranoid worldview. She was acting suspiciously, failed to properly identify herself, and has been uncooperative throughout this encounter, Cross announced to the crowd, though anyone who had witnessed the interaction knew these claims were false. Zoe, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up in her own defense. "Sir, I told you I was coming from the library. I offered to show you my library card, and I've done everything you asked me to do. I don't understand why you're treating me this way." Her words, delivered with quiet dignity despite her obvious fear, seemed to strike a chord with several members of the crowd. Someone began to clap slowly, and others joined in, creating an surreal moment of community solidarity that only served to further enrage Cross. "Enough!" he shouted, grabbing Zoe's arm more roughly than necessary. "You're all going to witness what happens when people don't respect law enforcement in this community." It was at that precise moment that Judge Roberto Martinez's unmarked, sedan pulled up to the scene. He parked quickly and stepped out of his vehicle, his trained legal mind immediately assessing the situation. What he saw made his blood run cold. His daughter, surrounded by a crowd of concerned citizens, being manhandled by a police officer who appeared to be completely out of control. Judge Martinez was not an imposing man physically. At 52, he stood about average height with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But anyone who knew him professionally understood that his quiet demeanor masked a razor-sharp intellect and an unwavering commitment to justice. He had presided over some of the most significant cases in the state, earning respect from lawyers, law enforcement, and civil rights advocates alike. As he approached the scene, he could hear Cross continuing his aggressive rhetoric, completely unaware that the dynamic was about to shift dramatically. "Dad!" Zoe called out when she spotted him, her voice breaking with relief. The single word carried across the street like a lifeline, and Judge Martinez quickened his pace. Cross turned toward the voice, expecting to see another concerned parent whom he could easily dismiss or intimidate. Instead, he found himself facing a man whose calm presence seemed to command attention without any apparent effort. "Excuse me, officer," Judge Martinez said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used in his courtroom. "I believe you're detaining my daughter. May I ask what this is about?" Cross looked the newcomer up and down, taking in his modest sedan, his casual weekend clothing, and his unremarkable appearance. In Cross's experience, parents who caused problems were usually loud, demanding, and obviously affluent. This man seemed almost disappointingly ordinary. "Sir, your daughter was behaving suspiciously and has been uncooperative with my investigation," Cross replied, puffing up his chest slightly. "I'm going to need you to step back while I complete this arrest." Judge Martinez's eyebrows raised, slightly at the word arrest, but his expression remained calm. "I see. And what specific crime is she being arrested for?" The question was asked in such a straightforward, professional manner that Cross momentarily faltered. Most parents became emotional or argumentative when their children were in trouble, making it easy for him to dismiss their concerns or escalate the situation. This man's quiet professionalism was somehow more unsettling than screaming would have been. She was acting suspiciously, and when I attempted to investigate, she became uncooperative, Cross repeated, though his explanation sounded— "I see," Judge Martinez replied, pulling out a small notebook that he always carried. "Could you be more specific about the suspicious behavior, and in what way was she uncooperative?" The simple act of taking notes seemed to rattle Cross, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "Sir, I don't have time to explain police procedures to every parent who thinks their kid is special. Your daughter is coming with me to the station, and you can discuss this with the desk sergeant." Judge Martinez looked over at Zoe, who was still standing quietly beside the patrol car, her belongings scattered on the sidewalk where Cross had forced her to empty them. His heart ached, seeing his composed, intelligent daughter reduced to tears by this unnecessary confrontation. But he knew that losing his temper would only make the situation worse. "Officer," he said, returning his attention to Cross, "I'm going to need to see your badge number and get your name for my records." Something about the phrase, "for my records," triggered a warning bell in Cross's mind, though he was too agitated to process it clearly. "My records? Who do you think you are, buddy? I don't answer to random civilians." Detective Santos, who had been watching this exchange while still on her phone with dispatch, suddenly felt a chill of recognition. There was something familiar about the quiet man questioning her partner, something that made her think she should know who he was. She ended her call and moved closer to the conversation. "I'm Roberto Martinez," Judge Martinez replied calmly, "and I believe there may be a misunderstanding here that we can resolve without further escalating this situation." The name hit Detective Santos like a physical blow. Judge Roberto Martinez was one of the most respected federal judges in the state, known for his fairness, his legal brilliance, and his zero tolerance for misconduct in law enforcement. She had testified in his courtroom twice, and both times had come away impressed by his careful attention to detail and his insistence on proper procedure. "Brandon," she said urgently, moving quickly toward her partner. "Brandon, we need to talk, right now." But Cross was too focused on what he perceived as a challenge to his authority to pay attention to his partner's obvious distress. "Mr. Martinez, I don't care what your name is or what you think you know about police work. Your daughter is in trouble, and my patience is running out." Judge Martinez nodded calmly and pulled out his phone. "I understand your position, officer. Let me just make a quick call to clarify a few things." "Put that phone away," Cross demanded, his voice rising to a near shout. "Nobody makes phone calls until I say so." The crowd, which had been relatively quiet during this exchange, began to murmur more loudly. Several people recognized the judge now that he had identified himself, and word was spreading quickly through the gathered onlookers that this was not just any concerned parent. Judge Martinez ignored Cross's demand and speed-dialed a number from his contacts. When the call connected, his voice remained perfectly calm and professional. "Commissioner Blake? This is Roberto Martinez. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday, but I have a situation here that requires your immediate attention." The mention of the police commissioner's name caused Detective Santos to go pale. She grabbed Cross's arm and tried to pull him aside, but he shook her off, still not grasping the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Sir," Judge Martinez continued into his phone, "I'm on Pine Avenue, and one of your officers is attempting to arrest my daughter for what appears to be walking home from the library while being 16 years old." Cross finally began to understand that something significant was happening, though he still couldn't quite process what it meant. The name Roberto Martinez was starting to sound familiar, triggering memories of departmental briefings and legal updates that he had never paid much attention to. "Yes, that's correct," Judge Martinez continued his phone conversation, his eyes never leaving Cross's face. "Officer," he paused and looked expectantly at Cross, who found himself automatically responding. "Cross, Officer Brandon Cross, badge. Number 2847, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Officer Brandon Cross, badge 2847. Judge Martinez repeated into the phone. "Yes, I'll wait right here." As he ended the call, Judge Martinez turned back to Cross with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the encounter. "The commissioner is sending a supervisor to help sort this out. I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding quickly and professionally." For the first time since the encounter began, Cross felt a flutter of genuine concern. The pieces were starting to come together in his mind, and he was beginning to realize that he might have made a serious error in judgment. But his pride and his ingrained defensiveness prevented him from backing down, even as every instinct told him that he was in over his head. The crowd continued to grow, and now many of the onlookers were openly discussing the fact that Judge Martinez was involved. Mrs. Torres was still recording, and several other people had their phones out as well, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming a significant incident. Detective Santos made one more attempt to salvage the situation. "Judge Martinez," she said, stepping forward with obvious deference. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. Perhaps we can discuss this calmly and work out a reasonable resolution." Judge Martinez nodded appreciatively at Santos's more professional approach. "Detective, I appreciate that. I'm simply trying to understand why my daughter, who was walking home from the library with her school books, has been detained and threatened with arrest." The simple, direct question hung in the air like a challenge, and Cross realized that he had no good answer to give. The suspicious behavior he had cited was nothing more than a teenage girl walking down a public sidewalk, and her uncooperative attitude had consisted entirely of politely answering his questions and asking to call her father. As they waited for the commissioner's representative to arrive, the true weight of the situation began to settle over everyone involved. This was no longer a simple case of an overzealous officer harassing a teenager. This had become a potential career-ending incident involving one of the most powerful figures in the state's legal system, and the entire encounter had been witnessed and recorded by dozens of people. The stage was set for consequences that would reach far beyond Pine Avenue, though Cross was only beginning to understand just how dramatically his world was about to change. The arrival of Captain James Wilson's patrol car marked the beginning of the end for Officer Brandon Cross's career in law enforcement. Captain Wilson was a 25-year veteran of the force, known for his no-nonsense approach to police work and his absolute intolerance for officers who brought shame to the badge. As he stepped out of his vehicle and surveyed the scene on Pine Avenue, his experienced eyes immediately assessed the gravity of the situation. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, many of whom were openly filming the encounter with their phones. Detective Santos stood off to the side, her face pale with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. Cross remained near Zoe, though his earlier aggression had been replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. And at the center of it all stood Judge Roberto Martinez, his calm presence serving as an anchor of authority in an increasingly chaotic situation. Captain Wilson had worked with Judge Martinez on several high-profile cases over the years and had developed a deep respect for the man's integrity and fairness. The judge had a reputation for being tough but fair on law enforcement, supporting good police work while holding officers accountable for misconduct. Wilson knew that if Judge Martinez was personally involved in a complaint, it was serious. "Judge Martinez," Wilson said, approaching with obvious respect as he removed his hat. "I came as soon as Commissioner Blake called. Can you tell me what happened here?" Before the judge could respond, Cross stepped forward, apparently still believing he could control the narrative. "Captain, I detained a suspicious individual who was uncooperative and disrespectful. I followed proper procedure throughout." Wilson's expression darkened as he looked at Cross, then at Zoe, who was still standing quietly beside the patrol car with her scattered belongings at her feet. Even without knowing the full story, the visual evidence told a clear story of excessive force being used against a cooperative teenager. "Officer Cross," Wilson said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority. "Step away from the young lady and let me handle this." Judge Martinez gestured toward Zoe, and she immediately came to his side, finally allowing herself to show the emotion she had been holding back throughout the ordeal. He put a protective arm around her shoulders while addressing Captain Wilson. "Captain, my daughter was walking home from the library when Officer Cross stopped her for what he called suspicious behavior. From what I can observe and what these witnesses have told me, she cooperated fully with his requests, answered his questions politely, and even offered to show identification. In response, Officer Cross forced her to empty her belongings on the sidewalk, made threatening gestures, and announced his intention to arrest her. Wilson looked around at the crowd of witnesses, many of whom nodded in agreement with Judge Martinez's account. Mrs. Helen Torres stepped forward, holding up her phone,